So I am pleased to introduce to us Sister Katarina Schuth. Sister Katarina is a member of the Franciscan Sisters at Rochester, Minnesota. She currently holds the Endowed Chair for Social Scientific Study of Religion at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity here at the University of St. Thomas. Her education includes an MA and Ph.D. in Cultural Geography from Syracuse University, an MTS and STL from Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and a BA from the College of St. Teresa in Winona, Minnesota. She is a faculty member and researcher with primary interest in theological education and the relationship between church and culture. Along with numerous articles, she has written 2 books on Catholic seminaries, the most recent being Seminaries, Theologates, and the Future of Church Ministry, published in 1999 by Liturgical Press. With Victor Klimovsky and Kevin O'Neill, she also authored Educating Leaders for Ministry, published by Liturgical Press in 2005. Her latest book, Priestly Ministry in Multiple Parishes, was published by the same press in 2006. And just recently, she has received a grant from the Lilly Endowment to write a 30-year retrospective and 10-year prospective on Catholic seminaries and theologates. Among her many writings on ministry, the most recent are a commentary entitled Reflections on a Changing Ministry and Changing Ministers in Same Call, Different Men, edited by Mary Gautier, Paul Pearl, and Stephen Fichter, published by Liturgical Press in 2012. And also a chapter entitled Assessing the Education of Priests and Lay Ministers, Content and Consequences in the Crisis of Authority in Catholic Modernity, editors Michael Lacey and Francis Oakley. This one published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Sister Katarina teaches in the areas of pastoral ministry, sociology of religion, and world religions, and carries on research on seminaries and church life. Her speaking engagements, workshops, and conferences for numerous institutions, organizations, dioceses, and individual congregations are scheduled regularly in the United States and nationally. I would like to add a personal note. Katarina doesn't like to draw attention to herself, so I'm probably going to embarrass her, but that's okay. I have known her most of my adult life. And here at St. Thomas, I've been pleased to become a friend and a colleague. For a brief time, I even had the wonderful opportunity to work with her directly. Here's what I know about her. She is deeply Franciscan, living out the values of the Franciscan life in her own life. She is a highly skilled scholar and a teacher who works tirelessly to improve the education of those who minister in the church, clergy and lay. Sometimes that means being a prophet whom nobody wants to hear. And I know that causes suffering for her, but she goes on courageously and with determination. And I have been so much inspired by that. Most importantly, she and others like her are fiercelessly committed to serving the life of this church. I say with humble gratitude that I owe my own calling and vocation to Katarina and others like her. And I suspect that there are many here who could say the same. So with great gratitude, I would like to introduce Sister Katarina Schuth.
It's a little difficult to read one's talk when being introduced in such a loving and caring way. Thank you, Kathy, for that. And you know, Franciscans don't like that so well, but here we are. I'm just absolutely delighted to be one of the presenters here today. And following a wonderful Dominican, it's a little bit hard for a Franciscan to be following a Dominican, to say nothing of a Jesuit and, and a diocesan priest, and so many of the other presenters who have given such tremendous talks. The ones I've gone to have been wonderful, and I've just heard a buzz among you as to how helpful and terrific the presentations in the small groups have been. Not nearly enough time. The gifts of for the church that each of you have brought, and the concern that you as an audience have brought to this moment are just wonderful. It helps keep alive, and it makes us realize how alive Vatican II is in so many ways. So thank you for being here all through this wonderful conference, and especially to those who prepared it. It takes a lot of work to do that. So the topic that I have today is one that I believe has not been researched at all, as far as I know. I hope not anyway. But it's one that I think is very important to understanding the question that was raised from the audience and given to Maureen about why haven't we progressed more. And I think I have a few ideas at the end as to why that might happen. But let me begin at the beginning. Before Vatican II, most seminaries closely resembled those prescribed by the Council of Trent. The document of 1563, the Decree on Seminaries, guided the seminaries for almost 400 years. Church leaders made few substantial changes for 4 centuries, though several models incorporated adaptations in style and method. To most Catholics, even past the mid-20th century, these institutions seemed enclosed and impenetrable. Much of what had transpired in seminaries for 400 years was about to change radically. This presentation focuses on how those changes, as outlined in Optatam Totius, which is a decree on priestly formation of Vatican II, have greatly influenced seminaries and pastoral ministry and continues to have an impact today. My presentation will have 4 parts. The first, very brief, a little bit of a history. Then I'll talk about the developments of Optatam Totius, the Decree on Seminaries, and its effects on 2 things: the programs of priestly formation that were developed from 1971 to 2005, 5 editions, and on theological schools. So the development of Optatam Totius and its effect on those 2 things. And then the reasons for the way it evolved as it did. And that's where I get into some of the explanation for why perhaps we haven't done quite as much with Vatican II as still needs to be done. And then finally, I'll look at some of the, again briefly, but at pastoral practice. Some of these questions we'll have to take up more this afternoon in discussion because of the time. But let me start with a bit of a pre-note, and that is to give you a sense of what schools we're talking about here. I'm using the general term theological schools, and it's meant to refer to diocesan seminaries and religious order schools of theology in the United States, where seminarians are prepared. Diocesan seminaries commonly also enroll religious order candidates, and both types of schools enroll some lay students as well. So what we're talking about now are some big changes in numbers. 1962, the beginning of the council, you see a very large number of seminarians, and then 10 years later the numbers began to go down, particularly so for religious order seminaries. Right after the council, the religious orders, the religious communities who had their own seminaries, very tiny seminaries, began to collaborate and bring them together in 2 large groups and then some others as well, but especially at the Chicago Theological Union, Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and Washington Theological Union in Washington. So you see that large drop from 134 to 67 seminaries in 10 years. That was exactly half. The average enrollment went up, which had some advantages. If we go back down to the bottom line, and that's where we are as of last year, this year's count is not yet in, but we see that the numbers have gone up a bit from 9 or 10 years ago, and 2 schools have closed, the Washington Theological Union, and this year the Seminary of the Immaculate Conception is merging with Dunwoody in New York. So in addition, we notice what is not on this chart is that many lay people are now enrolled, and the average number then goes up to 153, or 66 average in terms of lay people, but they are focused more on several schools, a dozen or so schools, and a lot of them in religious congregations schools. So that's a bit of a background just to get into that mode. The thesis, my basic thesis is this, that over 3 or 4 generations, depending on how you count, the focus of Vatican II has shifted, and we might say even diminished, in theological schools in some ways. And as a result, several distinctive models of pastoral ministry have evolved that make different use of Vatican II and have different understandings of Vatican II. I'll work that through as I present my paper. So first, a little bit of a history. I'm reminded of many years ago, I know people have said how long they've been in religious life. Well, I'll celebrate my 50th anniversary next summer. And when I first was in the community, we used to have what we called a summer catechism, 2 weeks, where you went and you tried your best to teach, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders who were delighted to be in summer school. I remember being in this small country parish and did my best to teach a whole church history in 2 weeks to 7th graders. And at the end, I asked them to write a little summary of what was included, what were the highlights of church history. And I'll always remember one student who had it right down. He said, first there was Jesus and the apostles. And then there were lots of wars and divisions. Then there were lots of saints and popes. And here we are now. In some ways, we might say that maybe seminaries are a little like that. Clearly, Jesus was the first seminary rector. His seminary program had all 4 pillars of the program of priestly formation: human, spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral. And it would be great to have a scripture scholar here tell us just exactly how all those 4 come into play. So that in sort of informal way of bringing the new apostles and others into the church as leaders and teachers happened for a while. Not much was said about a formal seminary until Augustine's time. The local synod in Carthage called for priestly training. So that was sort of the first real evidence that I could come upon. Even then, the majority of priestly formation was done in the form of apprenticeships with local bishops and parish priests. There wasn't much formal schooling. The next period of time, let's say 7th to 10th century or so, the cathedral schools and the monastic schools were the ones that were foremost, but they did not cover the entire church comprehensively, to say the least. There were some declarations from the Lateran councils in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries, but not too much was done. In the 12th and 13th century, a little bit more happened in terms of the university programs, such as in Paris, Bologna, and Rome. They began to have some formation. But these were largely for elite ministers in high society, as has been said in some of the history recollections of this. The clergy, the condition of the clergy was not very positive at that time, And so the residential life had a very rigid regimen, and they were expected not only to become learned, but to become holy. So that was a limited number of people who were able to enter into that, but it was important. So then the Council of Trent becomes such an important feature. Over a period of 20 years, from 1545 to 1564, the council addressed many issues related to the clergy. In an early session of 1546, a decision was made that colleges should be established solely for the priestly training in every diocese. John O'Malley says in his book on Trent, which will be out soon, it is difficult to exaggerate the canon's long-range influence. Can you imagine what that would have meant? There had not been this kind of overall coverage of education for priests. And what was more in that document, it represented a major change in seminary training, and it was a starting point for the existing seminary system as it was known until Vatican II. In John's book on Trent, Father O'Malley's, he shared several of the pages that deal with seminaries, and he gave a wonderful accounting of the courses, the curriculum, and they were really pretty comprehensible. Grammar, singing, keeping church accounts, and other useful skills, as well as Holy Scripture, church documents, practice of rites, ceremonies, etc. So I think they did a great job of having a pretty broad curriculum at that point. So there we were at Trent. The response to it was rapid. Lots of dioceses set up some sort of schools, but of course some had lesser resources than others, so there was great disparity in what these places were like. And we might say that that is true even into the 20th century, where there's considerable variation found in the quality of priestly formation programs. And perhaps we're doing a little bit better these days. So that's a bit of the background. Now, moving into Optatam Totius. This is the key document on priestly formation that comes out of the Second Vatican Council. I had never paid as much attention to it as I did in preparing for this talk, and it's just, it is just filled with wonderful, wonderful comments. And it's that notion of this being a pastoral council, I know there are different ways of talking about that, but certainly in this document, the pastoral life of the church is what is of concern to the bishops at Vatican II. Cardinal Sunens captured this necessary connection when he said, Vatican Council II must create a new kind of seminary in line with the needs of today. And he went on to say what all of that meant. Not all of the Council Fathers were in agreement, as some argued for faithfulness to past seminary training and processes. And it was a divergence of opinion between adaptation to changing circumstance and adherence to tradition that was the basis for the bishops' discussions on seminary training during the drafting of the decree. This summer I had an opportunity to read many of those discussions in a lot of the good books that have those discussions really almost reprinted word for word. And so you find just a great sense of what was expected. Some compromises were needed, but in the end, the schema was passed first with a vote of 2,074 for and 41 opposed. And then the final draft, after some elaboration and reordering, was passed with all but 3 or 4 votes that were against it. Way over 2,000 were for it. So it really was a major achievement to get the bishops to agree to this. So we know that it's something that the bishops thought about. When you begin to read the discussion, you know that the problem that we sometimes have today about the difference between the spirit and the letter. Well, the spirit is certainly represented in these discussions that the bishops had, and you can see what they were after. And it was definitely for the improvement in terms of the mission of seminaries and for the pastoral ministry of the church. Just very briefly, I'll run through the major points, and they're outlined on the overhead. The Optatam Totius first acknowledges the extreme importance of priestly training. On the one hand, it assures the more traditional bishops that it will strengthen the regulations of the past, and to the others, it promises those who see need for the new kind of seminary that it has added new elements that will make this, that will please them. So it was, again, keeping the two sides balanced and happy. But I would say that the side of change certainly won out here. The first section, that was the introduction. The first section gives a mandate to undertake programs in every diocese and every region to write their own program of priestly formation. And again, quoting John O'Malley, this time from What Happened at Vatican II, he says, it was also symptomatic of the Council's consistent concern for adaptation to local circumstances and for placing more discretion into local hands. And Father Jonkas, Michael Jonkas, last night really brought that out in terms of many aspects of the liturgy. So that was a very important point that was mentioned there. The second section deals with the crisis in, or the urgent need to foster vocations. And this is quite an interesting discussion because it talks about what the European bishops were already identifying as a crisis of vocations in many parts of the world, especially Europe. They were blaming the de-Christianized society, the smaller families, the failure of the church to encourage vocations. So the tendency to blame Vatican II for the decline of vocations, as we saw the numbers changing on that last slide, did not hold at all for Europe. And as a matter of fact, in the United States, the change came so quickly after the close of the council that it could hardly be attributed to the council. And yet it dropped by 25% in less than 5 years. And so it is difficult to say that that was the cause. But anyway, that's a very strong paragraph or section that remains in all of the PPFs. The third describes the setting of major seminaries and sets the tone and supports the decree that's systematically tied to the life and ministry of priests, the Presbyterorum Ordinis, and the document that would become Lumen Gentium. So there's a tying together of the documents that's been mentioned too. These were not segmented in little individual discussions. Everything was brought together. Bishop Carraro, speaking on behalf of the commission preparing the decree on seminaries, named 5 characteristics: the pastoral dimension, adaptation to the present day, adaptation to the needs of different localities and people, balanced synthesis, and appropriate renewal. Those were the things that the commission thought should happen, and then they were built into the rest of the document. The third section sets out toward the end of the end of formation is to be oriented totally toward the pastoral. It says, therefore, all the forms of training, spiritual, intellectual, and disciplinary, are to be ordered and with concerted effort toward this pastoral end. It's going out to the people. It's breaking away from the isolation of staying in the seminaries and not going out. We have, in I'd say virtually all seminaries today, a very well-developed pastoral and pastoral field education of various kinds like that. So that was something that was carried out and still goes on. The fourth section talks about careful spiritual training, and it begins with the admonition that it should be closely connected to the doctrinal and the pastoral. And it reinforces the concept of the servant model. It's really brought up for kind of the first time. It says that students should be admonished to give their lives with a generous heart and to understand most clearly that they are not destined for domination or for honors, but are given over totally to the service of God and pastoral ministry. That theme just is repeated and repeated. Formation is to be complemented, spiritual formation, with findings of psychology and pedagogy, so as to make sound decisions and develop human maturity. So already the seeds of human development, or the human formation dimension, are in this early thing, this early document. And then the ecclesiastical studies, the main point here is that those who are studying philosophy should do so that they gain a correct understanding of the characteristics of the contemporary mind and the connection between philosophy and the true problems of life. We'll see how that changes a little bit later. Talks about the importance of the study of sacred scripture and of dogmatic theology. And then sacred liturgy is to be considered as a primary and indispensable source of the true Christian spirit and should be taught according to the mind of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And then also students are to be given fuller understanding of other Christian churches and ecclesial communities as well as other religions. We see these themes come up over and over in the other documents. So again, it fits together. Then the integration of all of these, that's repeated, that all for the sake of the pastoral. And the final section deals with the fact that this ongoing education formation should happen, especially for younger clergy. The conclusion states that the synod pursued the work begun by the Council of Trent. Seminary faculty administrators have responsibility for forming future priests, and those preparing must realize the hope of the church and the salvation of souls committed to them. So its importance cannot be overemphasized. Some would say it represented an almost total overhaul of the entire system of training for priests. Others wanted to see it mainly as adjusting what was essentially part of the Council of Trent. It seems to me, given the points made, that the former view is the total overhaul is more accurate in light of the changes that have appeared in theological schools. So that's an overview of the document. Now, the third part is to see how the programs for theological schools have dealt with this. And what did they do with the document? First, there are two facets that I'll look at. One is to see how the U.S. Program of Priestly Formation, in its 5 editions, 1971, 76, 81, 92, and 2005, how each of those successively incorporated what was part of Vatican II, and I think it's quite enlightening. I'll put this up just to give you an overview, and I think it's quite easy to see, and maybe I'm blocking the bottom line, but the number of references of various kinds from 104 to 131 in the first 2, then back to 104, and then 67 and 53. I'm reminded of Michael Jonkus again last night when you were talking about the instructions on the liturgy. The first 3 were for implementing, and the last 2 were sort of for reforming the reform. So there's a bit of that's going on in this area too. That's one piece of the overview. Another is to look at the other documents, and I won't dwell on this, but you can see quickly how the first 2 used a lot of other of the Vatican II documents, I think 7 or 8, and with 25 or 30 references each, and then it dwindles off as time goes on. And I'll explain why I think that has happened eventually. I'll just go back to this. Whoops, that's one too many there. That'll just kind of remind us of what we have here. Let's see. Okay. Finding these references, there are about 800 pages in the 5 editions of the PPF. It's, you can't just go through and use your little find thing because they're referred to in different ways. So that's been a good part of the material that I have been looking at. So we see a real shift between the first 3 and the last 2. Well, what intervened, I'll come to in a moment. Just keep that as a question. What about the response of seminaries to Optatam Totius? We find, again, kind of like after the Council of Trent, there was almost immediate response, and seminaries very quickly adapted and took on what was communicated in Optatam Totius. Almost immediately following the council, seminaries made adjustments. And in fact, during the years and even as early as the 1950s, the reformation of seminary life was a topic of frequent discussion among seminary administrators and faculty. I remember shortly before Archbishop Roach died, I was doing some research on celibacy and what was taught about that now, and this was after the 2002 sexual abuse crisis, and he said he really appreciated to seeing all the things that were being done in seminaries at that point, and he said if only that had happened when I was in seminary or when I was early in charge of seminaries. He said it could have made a lot of difference. So there was already some sense that something had to be done. A common theme was the criticism of seminarians being too isolated and thus not prepared for engagement in ministry when they finished their studies and were ordained. The authors believed that seminary reform was key to the church's renewal. So that was recognized. I call that sort of the first phase. What I would call the second phase then were the changes that were reinforced with the publication of the first 2 issues of the Program of Priestly Formation. I've been doing research on seminaries for 30 years, but I wasn't in seminaries during those first 2 periods. And so I gained a lot of information from doing interviews in the early 1980s of people who had been in the seminary during those times, and how wholeheartedly they embraced the themes of the Vatican Council. They quoted frequently from the documents. They enjoined seminary leaders to change their institutions, that is the bishops. And so a lot was happening to make seminaries different kinds of places, much more like it looks today. Then the third phase is what I would say is what is represented again on this chart. And I want to just go to one further. So when we come to the fourth and fifth, what happens? We see a big change. And so the number of references to other documents really takes hold. Pastoral vobis, yes, and the Code of Canon Law. I kept seeing this CIC at the bottom of the pages when I was going through the program Priestly Formations, the last one especially. And so I thought, well, I've got to check this out. And there were on these at least 91 references to canon law. That just wasn't part of the thinking of any of the first three. And then, of course, the new Code of Canon Law obviously made a lot of difference, as did the publication of Pope John Paul II. So that's kind of what replaced, or at least filled in after the first three editions. Massimo Fagioli makes an interesting reference regarding to this pathway that I've described. In his book on Vatican II, The Battle for Meaning, he reinforces this pattern of evolution that I described. He says, the fidelity of mainstream Catholic theology to Vatican II meant rather undramatic work for university and seminary teachers who from 1966 onward transformed their courses in sacramental theology, ecclesiology, and anthropology, among others. I'm not quite so sure that the faculty I've known would have thought of it as undramatic and not too hard to work, but nonetheless, it was definitely just, they were ready for it. They were eager to do it, and there was no question about that. And then he goes on to say that did not prevent difficulties in the process of reception of the council documents. In opposition to the moderate and reformist attitude embodied by Paul VI, the questioning of the legitimacy of Vatican II created the first real discontinuity in the reception of the General Council in the second millennium. So even if the traditionalist movement became more and more radical in the 70s and 80s, it was there very early along, Massimo says. The seeds of doubt about the council were sprouting and growing, as we will see later reflected in seminaries as well as in pastoral ministry. So we see a tug already. The question this morning about that division in the church, the two sides, there's something of that brewing at this point. I'll give a couple of examples. There are dozens of them that I've worked out, but I can't go into all, time doesn't permit all of them. Let's just take the pastoral dimension. In the first PPF, that program of priestly formation, emphasized the relationship between belief and life, which was to be actualized in the theological method, and even more in the experience and reflection on the studies that the seminarians were undergoing. It really resounds the themes of Optatam Totius, which said pastoral concern ought to permeate thoroughly the entire training of students. It quotes that, in fact. And it includes a lengthy section on field education, the first PPF. By 2005, the last one, many other more pressing issues have intervened, especially those arising from sexual abuse. So the urgency of pastoral ministry education is somewhat diminished within the program of priestly formation. It doesn't receive much mention. However, I think seminaries have become so embedded in this idea that this is an important part of their formation that it hasn't been lost in spite of the fact that it's not emphasized as much as it used to be. So it's become kind of part and parcel of what we do now. So it's viewed as necessary, and there are lots of courses and there are lots of experiences that so many places have. The teaching of Scripture is another interesting contrast in terms of the first and the fifth program of priestly formation. Dei Verbum is quoted a lot in the latter, or in the former. It says that the course in sacred Scripture should serve to initiate the student in biblical criticism, contribute to his understanding of the message of the entire Scriptures, and provide a significant exercise in biblical criticism of particular parts. it goes through various phases, second, third, and fourth. By the fifth, it says this. The study of the Bible was described briefly, but it says the proper understanding of sacred scripture requires the use of the historical critical method, though this method is not totally sufficient. It doesn't give any clue of that in the earlier edition. So it's a little bit of a change in wording. The topic of integration, which I mentioned earlier, that is really sought very much in the first, and it's still a very strong and I think well implemented part of seminaries today. The idea of integration of the various parts of formation is definitely on the horizon. There are other examples, but I'll stop there. Methodology being one of the most interesting. So that's, we got that far. Now, how do we explain why this has happened? I think I'll say some general things and then go into what I think are couple of the specifics. In terms, that notion of the seeds of doubt being sown, I think that has a lot of effect on the way Vatican II is taught in seminaries. I hear this every place I go, and I've been doing this for 30 years. I've probably been on visits to seminaries 500 times, and that's probably not even enough. I mean, it was plenty, but it wasn't as many. It may have been more. Anyway, instead of studying the documents sometimes, what faculty tell me, and some of them promote it, but others don't, they say that the students like to spend time arguing about interpretation, implementation, spirit, letter, meaning, the kinds of divisions about it, rather than really delving into the documents and going into the background of it. So I think that's part of it. And it's hard to get away from that because of what's in the literature nowadays. The other thing, okay, so, the way it's taught. I think there are two other things that I did new research on. And this is about the bishops who were involved with each of the programs of priestly formation. I looked up in each case which bishops were on each of the various committees, the program of priestly formation committees. What were their ages in 1962? That's the beginning of the council. For the first edition, in 1962, their average age was 49. They ranged in age from 33 to 65. Several of them were not bishops yet. And then their median age was the same. So of those bishops, 14 of them attended every single session of Vatican II. It was deeply embedded in them. 3 attended 1 or 2 sessions. And then the 6 who didn't attend were not yet bishops, but they later got named to these committees in 1971 in the first case. So these bishops were so deeply ingrained with the thinking of Vatican II that when you look at the first program of priestly formation, it has all of these bolded sections with big chunks of Vatican II being quoted in various documents at various places. By the second edition, there were still a number of bishops who had been at the council. I think it was 3, and they still held very strongly and added some things at this point. I think it was understood a little bit more how it could be implemented. So their average age now is younger. They were 41. The range was from 28 to 53 at the time of the council's beginning. So most of them were already ordained. So they were also quite knowledgeable about that. The third group, their average age in 62 was 37. So they, too, would have been very much aware of Vatican II, and you see the other parts of that. By the time we get to, and none of them had attended Vatican II. By the 4th and 5th editions, the 5th, for example, the average age of those bishops at the beginning of the council was 16. They ranged in age from 5 to 23. None was ordained as a priest even at that point. It's just not part and parcel of what they grew up with. And so besides the direct participation in the council or being of age during the council, the popes who appointed each set of bishops may add to the explanation for their allegiance to the Vatican II documents or some later documents. I think that went in the wrong direction. No, I'm off here. Okay. These are the popes who named the various bishops who were part of the programs of priestly formation, who were the committees. So the first one has everybody from Pius XI. Well, that person was born, I think, in 1917. So he was a long time, he was really an old timer. And it went all the way up to Paul VI. By the time of the second edition, that was now 1976, Paul VI had made most of them bishops. And he was, and of course, all except one. And Paul VI, of course, was intimately involved with the council. By the third, they were still pretty much Paul VI, all Paul VI appointees. By the fourth, we see that John Paul, now that's 1992, there was 11 years between the third and fourth. So there only 2 were Paul VI, and most were John Paul II. By the fifth, 11 were John Paul II. So we see, you know, what they were focusing on was different at that point than it had been among the earlier bishops. Nobody's fault, it's just the way, you know, you do what's there at present. Something similar can be said about seminary faculties. In the earlier period, the people who were teaching in seminaries were, of course, following the council very, very closely. By the 1980s, most all were still of age, that is, you know, young adults, during Vatican II. So those who were now teaching in seminaries. I did a little check between the early 80s and the present time. There are only 70 faculty who are still teaching. That's a 30-year period almost. And of those 70, 39 are religious priests, only 7 diocesan priests who were teaching way back. Many of them became bishops and went on to other parish work and so on. But the religious, because that was their work, pretty much stayed with teaching. And we can figure that even those who weren't teaching in 1980, a few older people like myself, are working in seminaries still. So at most now, I think about 15% of all those who are teaching in seminaries had direct acquaintance as a young adult, or at least in Vatican II. By the 1990s, half were older, and the newer half were educated, but they were still, the younger ones, were still educated by those who had experienced Vatican II. By the 2000s, few are older, as I just mentioned. Many of the young ones now were educated by faculty in the graduate schools and doctoral programs by people who were not of age at the time of Vatican II. So it's just diminishing in the minds of a lot of people. That question was asked. That's kind of one of the things that I think is behind why we haven't implemented more. There's just a shift in understanding. Seminaries, on the other hand, have kept alive okay, yeah, I think okay. Seminaries, on the other hand, have done a very good job of keeping alive in their catalogs and in their courses, talking about Vatican II and its importance. This is by discipline, and that I'll look at in a moment. Somehow, one of the slides. Okay, this is the one I'm after. Here we see that there are more references nowadays in the same catalogs. I compared school for school. We see, especially in the disciplines, Vatican II is mentioned. So the importance of including something about Vatican II in courses is definitely there and alive among the faculty. So it's not, in that sense, something that is totally lost. There's the one on the specific disciplines. This thing seems to, I may be touching something wrong here. There, this is the one. Now here's, well, the big change here is in systematic theology. It is much more now talking about, in its course descriptions, about Vatican II. I don't know what this is going to mean in the future, but that's a kind of a new development. So that's, I think, a very positive sign. I'll give quickly 2 examples of how things have changed. Michael, Father Jankos last night did such a wonderful job on Sacrosanctum Concilium, so I don't want to duplicate any of that, but just to say that, you know, how are students being taught about Vatican II? I did a survey 3 years ago of all religious order and diocesan seminaries, of all those who teach liturgy and or music and liturgy. And one of the questions or one of the statements I made was, Sacrosanctum Concilium is the basis of our, meaning their seminaries, liturgical formation program. And I was delighted to see the results. 96% agreed, 66% strongly, and 30% agreed that that was the case. Only 4% disagreed. They were moderately satisfied with the liturgy, in the celebrations at their schools. They were concerned about one thing, and that was seminarians in our school are overly concerned about rubrics used in liturgy. 34% agreed, 17% weren't sure, and half disagreed. So, you know, at least a third found the seminarians to be too concerned about that. And more than half of the free comments, anything they wanted to say, were about the rigidity and stiffness of liturgical celebrations because of how seminarians wanted or seemed to move the direction along with whatever faculty leadership. But all in all, this survey, I think, suggests that Sacrosanctum Concilium is alive and well. I found that a very positive finding. I did this for the Federation of Diocesan Liturgical Directors, and they too were happy to see that kind of a response. The other one that I'll say something about is ecumenism. In the first program of priestly formation, there is an entire chapter dedicated to a communical dimension of theological education. It quotes several passages from the Decree on Ecumenism, and it details its relationship to spiritual, academic, and pastoral formation. The final section lists a number of concrete actions to be undertaken in implementing an ecumenical program, including cooperation with non-Catholic seminaries. It's a stirring chapter. It's a whole chapter, 7 or 8 pages. Very unusual. That's the first program of priestly formation. By the present one, there are 5 or 6 references, and now it requires a core course. That is the document, the program of priestly formation 5. However, in checking the catalogs, only 7 schools require a course in ecumenism, and 5 others have ecclesiology and ecumenism combined. Well, so, you know, that directive is not being followed. That accountability question, I think, comes in there. And yet, how many courses can the students take? That's the other part of the question. These are not simple issues, in a way. But that's one thing the bishops have not challenged, as far as I know. And I've seen a lot of the reports coming out of the Vatican visitations of seminaries in the early or mid-'80s, or 2000s. And so, you know, the accountability, do we really care about ecumenism or not? You have to have some accountability if that is the case. And yet, you know, the other dilemma of how much can be done, it's hard to figure that out. Anyway, just to finish off then, so that gives some ideas of how things have been implemented and the pros and cons of that. Okay, now to the last part. The changes in what can be said of Vatican II in relationship to pastoral ministry today, and what might we expect in the future? Great question. I think when we ask people nowadays, and I do ask students who might happen to know or have some idea about this, or older people when I give talks in parishes, what changes did Vatican II make? Of course, the liturgy is always the one that really comes into play. Father Jankos and Dr. Soser in his talk yesterday described this aspect of change very well. So the liturgy is in all the things that it is and isn't. The second is perhaps not quite as obvious, and yet I think for our purposes extremely important, and that is the changes in the persons who are ministering, who is ministering. Christine Fletcher talked very well yesterday about the involvement of laity, and she spoke of the fact that professional and volunteer roles in the church have really we've done quite well with that. Where we seem to be lacking is the work of the laity in the world as prescribed by Vatican II. So we have the involvement of laity, and we have the permanent deacons as changes. Well, just looking at this chart, it's pretty obvious what else has happened. The number of priests has gone down significantly, while the number of Catholics has gone up by 23 million, about 20,000 fewer priests. And poor sisters, I never thought I'd be well over 60 and still one of the younger sisters. But from 179,000, let's say 180,000 to 55, these are just huge, huge, huge changes. And also the permanent deacons from none in 1965, because the restoration came in 1970, so we see the numbers there, up to almost 18,000 permanent deacons. So what do we have then? We have a quite different picture of who is doing ministry. If we count the Catholic lay teachers besides, which are not represented here, this past year, 152,000 in Catholic schools, we have about 200,000 lay people working in the church professionally. 200,000, about almost 40,000 in parishes and that sort of ministry, and then another 152,000, and then the deacons on top of that. So we have a totally changed picture. So I think that is something that is a result of Vatican II, we can say, and it's something that in some guidance of the Holy Spirit or whatever, how fortunate we are that we have people, lay people, who are willing to give their lives very often for low pay. And that's to say nothing of those who are teaching in Catholic colleges and universities, those who are working in hospitals, et cetera. There's just an enormous number of lay people who have kept alive the ministry of the church in just very, very significant ways. So that's one thing. The other piece I want to talk about is probably the most difficult, and yet there's some pretty good research, so this isn't just coming off the top of my head. This has to do with what I would call the background, education, and mindset of priests and those young priests, and all priests, and those who are soon to be ordained. It gives further insight into what the future of ministry could be, might be, or we could maybe shift that in some ways. The wonderful book called The Evolution, Same Call, Different Men, The Evolution of Priesthood Since Vatican II. It's out on the table, and I think Maureen referred to it as well. It describes the generations of priests, 4 generations. I won't go through those because you're well familiar with it. The pre-Vatican II, Vatican II, post-Vatican II, and millennial. So in those groups, lots of questions were asked, but some that pertain to ministry particularly. The first 2 are about discussion. Opened a discussion about collaborating with lay ministers. It opened a discussion about working with lay administrators, so it's 2 different levels there. So the pre-Vatican II priests, who are not going to have to do very much of that since they're mostly over 70, they're really in favor of it. Then you get to the Vatican II priests and post-Vatican II, which would be people between about, let's say, 40 and 70. That big group, those 2 groups of priests are similar in their views almost throughout, with one exception. But then when we get to the millennial, the youngest priests, they're minus 18 compared to the pre-Vatican II, and minus 13 as far as even wanting to discuss it. Then when we get about allowing women greater participation in all lay ministries, the peak comes with the Vatican II priests. 89% really are in favor of that, and then 65% among the millennial priests. That's 24% fewer. Of course, that's still less than a third who are not in favor of that. So we have to look at I think there's a tendency to generalize about who our seminarians are and who our young priests are. There are some who are completely collaborative, collegial, cooperative, and some aren't. And I don't know how much that has to do with Vatican II, with their background. All kinds of things are involved in that. But I think we can't generalize too broadly about this, but we do see a big shift. And then the other one, ordination makes a priest essentially different from the laity. Again, the peak of those who agree with, the lowest number that agree is the Vatican II priests, the 61%, and then 88% among the youngest priests. It depends on what we mean by essentially different from the laity. There are ways in which that is absolutely true. If it's talking about privilege or entitlement, that's not so good. But if it's talking about the kind of service, the particular role, the particular functions of a priest, it's very true. So again, I don't want to overdraw from those, and you can make of it what you will. But those are two things, the big change in the ministry and the enormous change also then in the attitudes of the younger priests. And so then as I close, I would say, why are these differences important? Because as new generations of priests assume their responsibilities, the approaches they employ in the exercise of ministry become unmistakable signposts to the future direction of the church. Clerical leadership is singular in its power to shape the life of the Christian community. And so in the parish, it is the pastor who has the most immediate authority and control. Granted, lay people are having a huge impact in terms of what they do, but they are not in control, and that's pretty clear in a lot of different ways. So how the priest does this is very important. Thus, the formation of men in seminaries and schools of theology is a major determinant of whether, as future priests, they will be effective in their leadership roles, collaborative in their approach, and able to bring alive faith in parishes, schools, chaplaincies, and other ministry situations. The open question is whether or how will they be able to continue the tradition of Vatican II that we so cherish, as established in Optatam Totius and Presbyterorum Ordinis, the document on priestly life and ministry. So that's the question that we have, and we can simply ask for the guidance of the Spirit. And I think of Gamaliel in the Scriptures. If it's of God, it will go on, and I think we have that hope. As a Franciscan, we don't have great thoughts. The Dominicans have greater thoughts about that, but I think that the hope of the Dominicans we will cherish, and we will, as Franciscans, try to bring peace. I came across this. We will try to bring peace, is what I said, yes. I came across this little quote last week in reading from that wonderful new Give Us This Day little prayer book of St. John's. They had them available for free out there. They're just wonderful reflections. But anyway, this was a particular one that struck me. A monk, a Damascene monk in Jerusalem, representing his patriarch at the Third Council of Constantinople. The fulfillment of the law is Christ himself, who does not so much lead us away from the letter as lift us up to its spirit. So may we be lifted up and continue to lift up the spirit of Vatican II. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and as was mentioned earlier, there's a roundtable discussion this afternoon, so there'll be time to flesh out additional questions and conversation. But if you could please stand and tell us who you are, keep your questions really succinct so we can make that use of the time, and if you can navigate toward one of the mics, that would be great.
Yeah, Christine is in the back. Christine Fletcher. Okay. First on the lay faculty, like every other group who works in seminaries, they are very different in their attitudes, beliefs, values, what they hold, how they teach, what they know about Vatican II, how they regard it. All of that varies as much among lay faculty as it does among priests. So it's hard to say that it's going to, in that sense, directly impact in that way. As I said, it's across the board. As far as the law and the lay people becoming becoming canon lawyers, is that kind of what you were referring to? Interestingly, in 2 weeks I'm giving a talk on all of this sort of thing to the Canon Law Society, so I'll use your question. But you know, it's hard to say because, you know, while they have experience with canon law, it's how much lay people will be drawn upon, as was Maureen's point earlier. You know, if lay people, women and men, are not drawn in to be asked about these things when synods or whatever kind of meetings take place, it isn't going to make that much difference. It may make some difference locally, you know, that they'll have some understandings. I mean, we all come from different places and add our understanding, but where that goes is still hard to say.
Thank you.
Yes, oh, David, yeah.
Yes, Katarina, thank you for your presentation. This is a question, I'm just wondering what your sense of this might be. As you know, I taught in seminaries for about 16 years, and one of the things that troubled me a bit about the patterning of the program for priestly formation was this discussion of the four aspects, which, as you said, at Vatican II, it seemed to sort of culminate in the pastoral, and which would lend itself to a real praxis kind of orientation about how you do theology and all of that. I get the sense that instead of being viewed as a kind of a holistic way of formation, it's often broken up into isolated categories. Like, here's the pastoral faculty, here's the spiritual faculty, here's the academic faculty. I'm just curious about your comment on that. I think one reason it comes up for me is it appears also then in co-workers in the vineyard, so that lay ministry formation is viewed, you know, with that same lens. And I wonder if you know of other models, or if you just have any comments on how you perceive that being implemented.
Yeah, David Stother was at the seminary here. I've known him for years as he went from one seminary to another that closed behind him. And he's now at Cardinal Stritch and a wonderful liturgist. Well, that's a question I'd love to have my rector, Monsignor Callahan, or our director of pastoral formation, Father Kuss, answer. However, I will do my best. I think seminaries have made a concerted effort to integrate those four pillars, but again, like everything, it varies from place to place. It varies from time to time, and the more familiar the younger new people entering into this are with what other people do, the more likely it is to be integrated. And sometimes they're so busy getting used to new things that they don't do that very well. And the truth of the matter is, in the last 10 years, there has been a huge turnover in who the faculty are. I gave that a 30-year thing. You know, only 70 left over from the past. Well, that's not a nice way to put it, but 70 older people who were around. And so, you know, the younger ones, I know how hard it is. They're struggling to figure out how to teach their course, let alone figuring out how to integrate. So, and in pastoral courses, it's a lot easier. I teach pastoral ministry, so Father Kuss is new for us, but in the past, we've done a lot to see that what they're doing in the field is integrated with what they're learning in pastoral courses. But thank you, that's a great question. It varies, is what I'd say. Yes, Father Schultz.
Yes, Father John Schultz, Eau Claire. Want to get me a picture taken, huh? Okay. Go ahead. Okay. I'm going to speak in some generalities and ask a question. I was ordained 10 days after the council ended. And in real generalities, a goodly number of us my age thought those priests over a certain age kind of didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm that age.
Yes. You're the problem.
Yeah, yeah. And now, in generalities, a number of us think that those who are much younger don't know what's going on. Speaking in broad generalities. Okay. I'm wondering from your perspective, as you set up the generations, the millennial generation or the post-Vatican II generation, is the difference mostly between me and them, if that's a fair way to put it, because of what's taught in the seminaries, or is that the seminarians themselves are coming in with a much different background and perspective and world experience and all that? Again, these are real generalities.
Yes. Wonderful concepts that you're talking about. I hope we can come to it again this afternoon. For one thing, you know, we talk a lot about the Catholic culture isn't what it used to be. So that means most of these young people haven't come, seminarians, haven't come from that kind of a background. And so, that's going to make a difference in how they perceive things. That need for stability and for kind of having things settle down, that I think is very much a part of it. But I think there are some other things that are at work. Mike Jonkus last night had this wonderful thing about the younger generation wants to kill what the older generation just did. So I think there's some of that going on too. I thought that was a great insight and kind of a sad one, Michael. But, it's just the way it is, right? So there's part of that that's going on. There's a great variation among the younger people too, again, not to put everybody in the same box. I think they're very nervous as they go into ministry and so on. After a while, priests get used to what they're doing. They get much more comfortable with it. You see those changes. I've been at the St. Paul Seminary for 22 years. By the way, our academic dean, Dr. Thompson, is here too. I want to recognize everybody, and Sister Paul Treese, who teaches scripture, so that I don't get in trouble. Oh, and I see a couple more. I better stop. Anyway, thank you for being here. But I think that what happens then is, it depends a lot on how they take to what they hear. And I saw that wonderful piece on Vatican II that Maureen showed that student had done. In my pastoral ministry class early along, I play about a half-hour video, that wonderful PBS thing that Joe Komanchek narrated. And, there are these beautiful pictures of the face of John the 23rd. How could you not love that man? And in part of that video is when he dies, and the people around the world are in tears, and they pour into the Vatican Square. And, the year that Pope John Paul II died, the student said, he wasn't the first pope that was loved, was he? Kind of like surprised. And I said, no, we really, in my era, we loved Blessed John the 23rd every bit as much as people love Blessed John Paul II. So I think there's some of that. They just don't know some of what that has been. And then John O'Malley mentioned something that I hope we can talk about more too. There is something about the depth of spirituality, and Maureen kept talking about being ready to meet her God. I hope I'm at least a little bit leaning in that direction. Anyway, I think as people get older, you get some depth to what you have, and you start taking a little different stance on things. So I think all of that helps, and it does make a difference between young and old. So we've got a real mix of stuff going on right now.
Thank you, Sister, for your research. In your work and research with seminaries, do you think that seminary formation is prepared for the demographic shift in the United States in the Catholic communities?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, because the demographic shift is alive and well. I do a lot of research on that too. It's almost certain that in just a few years, 2020 is kind of given that at least half of the church will be Hispanic, Vietnamese, various Asian, African, etc. The Caucasians will be the minority in no time at all. So, I think there are efforts made at that. Lots. I've done a whole thing of what seminaries have done about Hispanic ministry, Spanish language, etc. A lot is being done, but again, some seminarians just can't do all of that on top of studies that are hard for some of them. To learn Spanish if they haven't learned it before. But it's certainly in the awareness of a lot of people. In terms of liturgy, I think Michael could speak a lot. I mean, he did speak to that last night, actually, in wonderful ways, but there's not nearly enough of that going on. However, almost, I don't have the numbers in my head, but it's at least 3/4 of the dioceses have an office for some kind of multicultural, intercultural, that sort of thing. So there's some of it, but boy, we really need to focus. A terrific thing to keep in mind. Thank you.